He was the missing puzzle piece, the cause of the lone empty spot in the display case. From the moment his Time Warner contract expired in the spring of 2002, fans would spend more than 12 years wishing and hoping for an appearance from the icon himself inside a WWE ring. And in 2014, the moment of truth finally arrived, as Sting, the heart and soul of World Championship Wrestling, crossed over into McMahon territory. Unfortunately though, Sting's run in WWE would be quite underwhelming. In fact, the entire tenure was about as well thought out as building a playground on a fresh nuclear waste burial site. But that doesn't take away from the magnificence and brilliance that would define Sting across the decades, whether he was the blonde-haired Scorpion or the dark-tinged Crow, the exuberant hero or the shadowed Avenger, the buster of fiends or the slayer of beasts. For as long as Sting appeared on our screens, we knew we were watching one of pro wrestling's preeminent superheroes, no matter what the year was. A name like The Icon doesn't get bestowed so easily, but for the man they called Sting, it's an apt description. I'm Sam from Cultaholic.com, and here are 10 things you didn't know about Sting. Join us. Number 10, a different path. Particularly in his days as Surfer Sting, Steve Borden displayed an endless amount of enthusiasm and energy in both his interviews and his matches. After his seminal time limit draw with Ric Flair on the first Clash of the Champions in March 1988, Sting began to earn appreciation for his wrestling abilities and performance instincts. While much of the Sting mystique hinged on his character and portrayal, there's no denying that he could hold his own as a wrestler, working in some truly inspired matches. And that's why it may come as quite a shock to those who've seen Sting at his very best that he wasn't a fan of wrestling while growing up. According to Sting, he didn't have television access to wrestling, and thus never had an affinity for it. Rick Bassman, his eventual trainer, tried to sell him on the business, but it took many tries. It wasn't until Sting decided to take in a WWE event in Los Angeles in the mid-80s, where he saw the likes of Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, that he was taken in by the spectacle. And from there, he decided to give wrestling a try. Number 9, Power Up. The name Sting came along for Borden in 1986 when he and then tag team partner Jim Ultimate Warrior Hellwig joined Mid-South Wrestling, where they would be known as the Blade Runners. Borden took the Sting name while Warrior at the time was known as Rock. Prior to the Mid-South run, Sting and Warrior worked in both California and in Memphis's Continental Wrestling Association under some rather different names. Initially, the two were members of a group known as Power Team USA, and that was followed by the Freedom Fighters in Continental. In both cases, Sting used the name Flash as his professional handle, while Warrior was then known as Justice. Through the years of the name Sting being immortalized as one of the all-time great one-syllable wrestling names, it's pretty hard to imagine Flash pushing Ric Flair to the limit, or Flash silently eyeballing the NWO from the arena's rafters. As far as name changes go, Sting was definitely an upgrade. Number 8, Battles of Destruction. Pouring through a wrestler's resume can turn up some very unusual matches, the kind that immediately send you dashing towards YouTube to see if there's even shaky 90s handycam footage. In his time with NWA and WCW, Sting would work with hundreds of different wrestlers, from the biggest stars the sport's ever seen to low-level enhancement talent whose names are barely remembered. And sometimes, just sometimes, Sting would even work with wrestlers that would eventually become main event peers. And if you can believe it, Sting is the only man to have wrestled both The Undertaker and Kane in WCW. In 1990, Sting would tangle with Mean Mark Callis not too long before Mark Calloway would don the hat and duster that costumed him as WWE's Grim Reaper. And a few years later, in early 93, Sting would defeat 25-year-old Glenn Jacobs, working under the name Bruiser Mastino, for a taping of WCW Saturday Night. So while it wasn't Undertaker and Kane at their most famously macabre and ghoulish, working both in their formative years is still listed in Sting's portfolio. Number 7, a helping hand. In the mid-90s, as WCW was picking up steam with its fresh and bold new direction, the likes of Eric Bischoff, Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and others were grasping for political airspace in a successful yet cutthroat atmosphere. Sting has never been listed among those known for political maneuvering or selfish behavior, but he did have a hand in one of the more shocking moments in the history of the Monday Night Wars, acting as a go-between. Sting relayed the fact to Eric Bischoff that his good friend Lex Luger was working working without a contract in WWF. Bischoff was nonplussed, having little time for Luger based on his attitude, but Sting insisted on talking to Lex. And so it was in the garage at Sting's home shortly before the launch of Nitro that Sting, Luger, and Bischoff had a summit, where Bischoff offered Luger a fairly lowball contract while also imposing the condition that he couldn't give Vince McMahon notice. Committed to jumping, Luger agreed to the terms, and there it was. Lex Luger's stunning WCW return on the debut episode of Nitro came to be after a secret meeting in Sting's garage. Number 6. Believe in Angels. One of the most awing transformations of any wrestling character took place as 1996 came to a close. The exuberant and fiery Sting that we all knew gave way to a sullen, emotionless void bedecked in all black save for the white makeup. This silent and brooding variation of Sting has been referred to as Crow Sting due to the obvious similarities to the resurrected Eric Draven from the Crow movie and comic. Sting has attributed the idea for the look to Scott Hall, but according to the 2018 book Nitro, the idea for Sting to go goth came from artist and special effects expert Andre Freitas, who worked on designs and concepts for the company. Freitas claims to have proposed the character to Sting personally at his studio, showing him not only imagery from The Crow, but also Marilyn Manson, as well as the bodysuit worn by Kyle MacLachlan in David Lynch's Dune. Freitas says that Sting was hooked once he was presented with the medley of ideas and images, and the design process began from there. Number 5. European Dream. Forget WWE's World Cup, partially because it wasn't a World Cup and mostly because it would help Ross sleep better at night. But if you want to talk about international wrestling tournaments that are destined to be relegated to the dustbin of history, then look no further than the WCW European Cup. During the few times that the company held such cross-Atlantic tours, WCW organised a pair of European Cup tournaments, one in March 1994 and one in November 2000. And wouldn't you know it, it was esteemed veteran Sting that won both tournaments, although said tournaments were very, very different. The 1994 version was a 16-man deal that boasted a number of truly talented stars and saw Sting defeat Stevie Ray, Ron Simmons, Steve Austin and Vader over the span of several shows to capture the cup. 6.5 years later though, Sting won a bizarre 4-man tournament in which he received an automatic bye into the finals, defeating Kevin Nash, who had to defeat Mike Awesome and Alex Wright in a 3-way qualifier on the same show. Talk about a tale of two WCWs. Number 4. Lucrative Revenge. For more than 15 months, Sting did not wrestle a single match, and very, very rarely, if ever, verbalized his thoughts or motivations. He stalked WCW events, keeping a watchful eye on the New World Order, waiting for the right time to unleash his fury. That time would come at Starrcade 1997, where he challenged Hollywood Hulk Hogan for the world title in what sadly turned out to be a counterproductive clusterfrig of a match, with Sting winning the gold. The angle was built masterfully though, and certainly found an audience. Per research done by Wrestling Observer statistician Chris Harrington, Starrcade 97 did 700,000 pay-per-view buys, far and away the highest buy rate in company history. Not only did it obliterate the prior WCW record, 405,000 for that year's Halloween Havoc, but at the time, only one WWE pay-per-view had ever done a higher amount of buys, WrestleMania 5 in 1989, which did 767,000. Point being, many people wanted to see Sting knock off the tyrannical champion Hogan and were more than willing to pay to see it. Number 3. Ready Player One. WCW video games are much like their WWE counterparts in that they're a bit of a mixed bag. There were some absolute gems like WCW NWO Revenge and WCW vs NWO World Tour, as well as some true bags of piss like Backstage Assault and the oft-forgotten Game Boy game The Main Event. But, good or bad, Sting has been there through it all, literally. Being WCW's franchise player throughout the company's existence also means you're the face of their products. WCW released 10 video games between 1990 and 2000, and Sting is the only wrestler to have appeared on all 10. Whether he's wearing Wolfpack foreshadowing red and black tights on Nez's WCW Wrestling, or swinging a cattle prod on the late 90s Mayhem release, Sting has been the one constant in all of the games, more so than the ring itself, which Backstage Assault thoughtfully excluded. The likes of Ric Flair, Lex Luger, and the Steiner brothers all have a game or two that they missed, leaving Sting as the model of consistency. Number 2. The Fame Game. When TNA opened up its Hall of Fame in 2012, it seemed a bit premature given that the company had only existed for 10 years, but whatever, it's still cool to see some of the greats earn immortalization in one way or another. Sting would be the first inductee into the Hall of Fame back in the fall of 2012, a tribute to his importance in adding to the legitimacy of a promising young company in the mid-2000s, providing their main event scene with reliable star power for a number of years. It will go down in history that Sting was the very first man to have been included in both the TNA and WWE Halls of Fame upon his induction into the latter's sanctum in 2016. Since then, 4 other men have matched Sting's dual honor, including Kurt Angle, Jeff Jarrett, and the Dudley Boys. But none of them won over audiences like Sting did when he used a demonic bird to hold Eric Bischoff hostage. Good times. And number 1, leader of the pack. From the time of the storied time limit draw with Flair, through the end of his long run with TNA, Sting had been often relied on to be the face of the places in which he's wrestled. WCW, TNA, and other promotions understood Steve Borden's value as a living, breathing superhero. And that standing was rewarded with a number of world title reigns that almost equals Ric Flair's oft-bandied about total of 16. Depending on what you consider a world title, Sting has held a total of 15. In WCW, he would hold belts considered a world title 9 times, 6 WCW titles, 1 NWA title, and 2 times with the sometimes forgotten WCW International title in 1994. For TNA, add 5 more, 4 times with the Impact Wrestling belt, and once with the NWA title when TNA still used it. There's also the World Championship of the very short-lived World Wrestling All-Stars promotion in 2002, but if you exclude it, we really wouldn't blame you. Regardless, that's a lot of world title reigns. But few would ever argue that the man behind the makeup, whichever scheme he was wearing in whatever era, didn't deserve them. Now that is an icon. And that's our list. I've been Sam from Cultaholic.com. You can follow me on Twitter here. You can follow all of us at Cultaholic. If you like what we do, you can check us out on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Cultaholic. And no matter what you do, don't ever forget to hit subscribe and join us.